by David Brooks, and I'll introduce him in a moment. I just want to say a few words at the outset. I'm John White, for those of you that don't know me. I'm the director of the Life Cycle Institute. Mr. Brooks is here as part of our annual Daughters of Isabella lecture. We're very grateful to the daughters for funding this lecture series, and certainly for Mr. Brooks for taking time out of what is an extraordinarily busy schedule to be with us today. I also want to publicly thank the staff of LCI because they've done an enormous bit of work in getting the word out on this event, on all the things that will happen afterwards. I also want to call to your attention that when the event concludes at 5 o'clock, the good news is that we have two of Mr. Brooks's books available out in the foyer, and they are Bobo's in Paradise and On Paradise Drive, and he's consented and agreed to spend a bit of time signing those books. So if you wish to purchase one after the event and help his wife and children, I'd be delighted to add a signature to that book. Everyone here, I'm sure, knows David Brooks as a commentator on PBS, in fact, not only a commentator on PBS, but many public affairs programs. And of course, we've watched throughout the election season his commentary, often with our friend here too at LCI, Mark Shields, who has come to visit us many times. David also writes a column for the New York Times, which appears on Tuesdays and Saturdays. And his column today, which I'll speak about in a moment, is extraordinarily perceptive. I first became acquainted with him largely through his own written work, particularly the book Bobo's in Paradise, which I thought was an incisive observation about the merging of what he called the bourgeois bohemian culture to produce a new kind of American species, often found in places like Burlington, Vermont, but also in the suburbs of Philadelphia and elsewhere. And I've relied on that book considerably when I wrote The Values Divide. I'm writing a new book now, which I won't get into, obviously, on the 21st century, but I found On Paradise Drive, what David is going to talk to us about today, to also be incisive. He's taken us on a journey from Bethesda to Frederick, but it's really more than just a journey of about 30 miles. It's really a journey across the country into many places, into two very different and parallel universes. And America, as our values divide, in my view, not David's, has grown. I think the idea that we do live in two very separate and diverse countries with two different cultures has grown. David calls his work comic sociology. I don't call it that. I call it perceptive politics. And so I'm delighted to give you one of the most perceptive observers of American politics, David Brooks.
Thank you. Since John mentioned this drive, I might as well start by talking about that. It's a drive that I take in the book On Paradise Drive, not quite from Bethesda to Frederick, but from Tacoma Park to Frederick, and which is a more humorous starting point. Because I do think, and it's true in this area where we live, but it's also true in most metro areas, that you don't have to drive far to see radically different sorts of people. If you start by driving in Tacoma, which is, I don't know how many miles from here, not too far from here, you find yourself in a very progressive place. Howard Dean, Dennis Kucinich sort of place. It was a nuclear-free zone in the 1980s, though I'm not sure the Pentagon was greatly inconvenienced by the fact they couldn't base ICBMs in Tacoma Park, Maryland. But still, the point was made. And it's just, you walk around and you see you're in a very distinct, sort of crunchy area. There are pottery galleries and dance collectives and sandal stores. Political progressives have a thing for toe exhibitionism I don't really understand. You see a lot of Volvos, Saabs, and Audis, because in Tacoma Park it's socially acceptable to have a luxury car so long as it comes from a country hostile to U.S. foreign policy. And, you know, the local schools there are bad at all sports except those involving frisbees. And I actually was at a playground there, and somebody had named, I had my kids, and somebody had named their kid Mandela, which is fine unless Mandela is really behaving badly, and you're screaming, "Mandela, shut up, Mandela, shut up, Mandela!" You know, you're screaming at one of the saints of the 20th century. It's its own culture. It's one culture, and it's part of American suburbia. But then you drive over across the Beltway a little ways, and you get to the Chevy Chase, Bethesda area, and you're in a different area. It's a little left progressive, though it tends to be a Democratic area. It tends to be a little more affluent. I like it because you can. There are so many people get the New York Times, the blue New York Times delivery bags are there on the driveways in the mornings. Sort of, so many of them, it's sort of visible from outer space. This big clump of blue plastic bags, and you've got people, sort of professionals, lawyers and doctors, trying to reconcile their high incomes with their high ideals. They shop at Ben & Jerry's ice cream. We've got one in Bethesda where I live. Ice cream company with its own foreign policy. I always say Ben & Jerry's should have a pacifist toothpaste that doesn't kill germs. Just ask them to leave. And then we've got on Wisconsin Avenue, we've got a Whole Foods Market, which is an organic grocery store with vegetarian dog biscuits, basmati rice, all-natural hair coloring, because if you're going to artificially color your hair, you want it to be all-natural. And then on right in downtown Bethesda, right near some of the furniture stores, there's a Trader Joe's. I don't know if you guys have been to the Trader Joe's supermarket. All the cashiers look like they're on loan from Amnesty International. My favorite part of Trader Joe's is the snack section, because they can't have snacks like pretzels or potato chips. That would be vulgar, socially retrograde, contributing to the obesity of America. So the snacks are made out of seaweed, or what we favor in my family, the veggie booty with kale, for kids who come home saying, Mom, I want a snack that'll help prevent colon rectal cancer. One snack, and they've got a certain, when you're in Bethesda and Chevy Chase, you're in the super high achieving, sort of educated elite, Walt Whitman High School. There, the average SAT score of Walt Whitman is 1310. So the average public high school student is somewhere in the 90th percentile, which is very distinct. And that's because you've got a lot of people who are highly educated themselves, affluent, and can give their kids a lot of advantages in life. I've begun studying a distinct group of people in Bethesda and in these inner ring suburbs called the Uber Moms, who are these highly successful career women who've taken time off to make sure all their kids get into Harvard. And you can usually tell the Uber Moms because they weigh less than their kids. Sort of even at the moment of conception, they're doing little exercises, plotting what year they can become school auction co-chair. And then, they go into the delivery room, they're adjusting the video lighting, they're cutting the umbilical cord themselves. They've taken so many soy-based nutritional formulas that the babies come out huge, like, sort of toothless defensive linemen. And then, the first question is, so is her APGAR score above average? Expecting to be taken off to the gifted and talented maternity ward. And then, the preparation for the meritocracy begins immediately. You see the kids going to the 4th grade with these 80-pound backpacks on their back. If the wind blows them over, they're like beetles. They can't get up. And then I'm sure you guys all know the rigors of getting into a college. Some of these kids, by the time they apply to college, they've cured 4 formerly fatal diseases. They've started 6 companies. They've done community service in Tibet. Actually, Steve Trachtenberg, local college president here, says of the community service, I don't know where these kids find lepers, but they find them and they read to them. Which sort of captures the community service mania. And that's part of a change in life. A change in lifestyles emanating out from these suburbs. A lifestyle based on achievement. If you're a college student here, you remember the most supervised generation in human history. Tom Sawyer may have had somebody to tell him to sit up straight and wear a starched collar when he was inside, but he could also play out in the Mississippi River for 8 hours a day. There aren't many kids who are raised with that kind of freedom anymore. The University of Michigan does time analysis studies of how children are actually raised. And basically over the past 15 years, there's been a revolution in child raising. The amount of time spent just hanging around outside, just hanging out in the neighborhood has dropped by 20% or so. The amount of time spent just at home doing imaginative free play has dropped by 20 or 30%. The amount of time spent watching TV has dropped by about 20%. The amount of time spent in adult supervised, structured, skill-enhancing activities has risen 20%. The amount of time spent doing homework is up 20%. The rigors of high school have increased substantially. Homework levels, most people think, have risen substantially. In other words, you've got a different sort of childhood. One part spent making your own fun. The next sort of childhood spent in adult structured adult activities. And that's a revolution that's come out of a lot of these suburbs and has taken over all of America. My son plays baseball. He's 13. He plays year-round. It's almost his sole sport. The Bethesda Chevy Chase Little League hires a professional baseball player to coach them year-round. No more pickup games. And this is utterly typical. I look at my daughter, who's 10. I look at our garage, and I see 4 helmets there. And to me, those 4 helmets symbolize a certain sort of childhood. She's got an ice hockey helmet, which she plays. She's got a bike riding helmet. She's got a horseback riding helmet. And she's got a helmet just for riding, or a batting helmet for her Little League baseball. And it's a certain sort of childhood, one in which the head is extremely well protected, obviously. But it's also a childhood where my wife and I are driving her to structured activities. And that's a revolution that's taken over America. And I think it's the result of the purification of the meritocracy. In the old days, if your gender was wrong, if your race was wrong, if your accent was wrong, if your geography was wrong, you had limited chances to reach the apogee of society. Now, we're certainly not equal in giving those chances, but we've become a little more equal. And as we become more equal, the competition to get to the top has become more fierce. And in this more competitive environment, the whole nature of family and work have been changed, and you can see it in its purest form in places like Bethesda. Then you get back in the car, and we're still driving through suburbia. You head up Rockville Pike. And if you go up Rockville Pike a couple miles, you find yourself surrounded by a China Star restaurant. You find yourself surrounded by an El Salvadoran grocery store, Pakistani video store. Suddenly you're in the Rockville area, not quite in Rockville, but on the way, and you begin to see these immigrant enclaves. And this is the invisible part of America. There are 35 million foreign-born people in this country, more than ever before, and we in the media don't cover this realm. There are immigrant enclaves. It used to be immigrants went to the cities and then moved out to the suburbs. Now immigrants go straight to the suburbs, and they've created new institutions there, new stores, new cultures, new churches, new mosques, and this is an entirely new sort of America that we know little about. But you've got incredible income diversity in these systems, and spontaneous things grow up. Near where I live, there's a soccer field, and the Nigerians play there on Saturdays. The Mexicans tend to play there on Sundays. I don't know how it got started, that Saturday was for the Nigerians, Sundays for the Mexicans. It got started, and now it's a local institution. And this part of America is a very important part, politically and culturally, and it's totally underreported. By the way, I just saw an interesting statistic that of the 10 immigrant groups most likely to become millionaires, 7 come from the Middle East. The Lebanese, Iranians, Israelis, Egyptians, and so on. There's just a whole culture out there. Then you're going further up Rockville Pike, and you get up toward Gaithersburg in Germantown. And now you're in a fast-growing exurban area. And in this exurban area, you're in a much more Republican territory. You're beginning to see a lot more Republican voters. The kitchens tend to be a little smaller, but the trucks tend to be a little bigger. And we have a rule where I live called this: the smaller the woman, the bigger the truck. So a size 6 is usually in a Chevy Suburban, size 4 in a Hummer, And you're in a different cultural zone. Only 5 miles up from the Immigrants or from Bethesda or from Tacoma Park, entirely different cultural zone. And this cultural zone is influenced by the game of golf. You really can't understand American politics or the Republican Party unless you understand golf. Not so much the game of golf, but the spiritual ideal of golf, the state of spiritual grace suggested by the game of golf, which is a state of grace called living at par. And when you're living at par, you're living on a higher plane than other people. Your DVD collection is well organized. Your cell phone rate plan is well tailored to your needs. Your toenail polish matches the interior of your Lexus. You've got your life so calm and corporate and together that next to you, Dick Cheney looks bipolar. You've just got a calm life, and you're living the perfect suburban or exurban now life. And you're shopping at the exurban institution, which is the core of many of these new places, the big box mall. If you go out to Germantown, or if you go out further west or to Loudoun County, which is the second fastest growing county in the country, if you go out to Douglas County, Colorado, which is between Colorado Springs and Denver, you find big box malls come first, and then people just follow. And you'll go to a place and there'll be 500,000 people living in a place where there was nobody 20 years ago. I mentioned in my column today that Mesa, Arizona, a suburb outside of Phoenix, has more people living in it than live in St. Louis, Cincinnati, or Minneapolis. And Mesa will soon pass Atlanta in population. These incredibly fast-growing places that are now heavily, heavily Republican. And if you go to a big box mall, you can go to the Home Depot, and you can see the essence of this culture. You can see a Republican suburban man buying a barbecue grill, which is when he's most emotionally exposed. He's going to the Home Depot. He's doing the manly suburban Republican walk that manly men do in the presence of large amounts of lumber. Sort of a waddling manly walk. Goes up to the barbecue grill section. There's a Thermidor. There's a Broil Master grill, a Weber Genesis grill, because in America it makes sense to name a barbecue grill after a book in the Bible. It seems normal. And it's, 328,000 BTU heat generating capacity, 542-inch grill surfaces, in case you get the urge to roast a bison. And he finds his grill, picks his grill, takes it out to his Yukon XL, a manly truck for manly men who haul things, and he's out in the middle of the big box mall. And I'm sure you've all been to them. You've got your PetSmart over here and Petco over there, Bed Bath & Beyond, Linens and Things, this huge parking lot stretching out in the middle of all these big box category killer stores. If you look across the parking lot, you can just see on the other side of the mall, just over the curvature of the earth, you can see an Old Navy, big enough to qualify for membership in the United Nations. These massive stores. Along the highway, there are these suburban chain restaurants, which if they merge would be called Chili's Olive Garden, Hard Rock Outback Cantina. One restaurant serving enough sun-dried tomatoes to feed Tuscany for a century. And then the anchor stores. You've got your Walmart over here, your Price Club over there, which is like Walmart on acid. The quantities that you can get your 41-pound tubs of detergent, your 30-pound bags of tater tots, your packages with 1,500 Q-tips, which is 3,000 swabs, since there's one on either end. Everybody's sort of having the same conversation about how much money they're saving by buying in bulk. So you'll hear somebody say, we should buy 10,000 popsicles because we were thinking of having kids anyway. Makes sense. And so there you're out in Germantown, you go up to Frederick, and you're in Republican territory. If you look at where George Bush made tremendous gains this election, it was in areas like the I-4 corridor in Central Florida, Mesa, Arizona, Loudoun County, Douglas County, up north. That's Republican territory. And there are more mega churches there and fewer Thai restaurants. But that is a divide, and you don't have to drive far to cross this divide that John talks about. And I happen to think that a lot of people in America have a lot of behavior that's the same. People divorce roughly in the same rates, no matter whether you're in red or blue America, whether you're in evangelical Texas or liberal Massachusetts. Massachusetts has the lowest divorce rate of all the 50 states. But there is a cultural divide, and there are different conversations. And when you talk about the electorate, you're talking about an electorate that is stable to me. You're talking about an electorate that is polarized into different camps and relatively stable. And part of that stability is geography. The red parts of America are getting redder, and the blue parts are getting bluer. The number of counties in this country where one party or another has a landslide majority has doubled in a generation. That's because people aren't tied down. They can move to where they want to move. They can move where they feel culturally comfortable. And they move to places with people similar to themselves. And they get locked into a conversation with people similar to themselves. And everything they know gets reinforced. And so that's one of the reasons we've seen this polarized electorate and this relatively stable electorate. There are a bunch of other reasons. I'll just run through a few to explain the political landscape. One is education. You would think that as people get better educated, they would become more independent-minded in their voting. They would switch parties. But that's not true. It's the exact opposite. The more educated a voter is, the more likely that voter is to vote for the same party again and again and again. Because the more likely that voter is to call himself or herself a liberal or a conservative. And once you give yourself a party label, you pretty much stick to the same party. So we've seen a decline in split-ticket voting over a generation as the electorate has gotten better educated. The media is another reason we've become polarized into different camps. You can now select which media you want to consume, Fox News or NPR, and they flatter pretty much what you want to say, what you want to believe. The story that we in the media call too good to check out it concerns Fox News. Somebody at Fox told me that they, some people wake up, turn on Fox at 6 in the morning, don't turn it off again until midnight. They leave it on all day, which is a fine habit, but the problem is Fox has a little translucent logo on the bottom of the screen, and it burns into your TV set if you don't change the channel. And Fox found they had to move the logo back and forth so it wouldn't destroy people's TV sets. I don't know if that's true, but it's a symbol of the loyalty that a lot of people have to different media sources. Then there are other reasons that people have polarized. One of the most interesting to me this year is careers. What career you have is a pretty good indicator of who you're going to give money to. We know a lot about who gives money to what parties. And one of the amazing things is people who majored in sort of the mathematics and sciences and business majors, the majors that require numerate knowledge, tended to give to Republicans. Business people give to Republicans, accountants give to Republicans, bankers give to Republicans. People who were in the liberal arts majors tend to give to Democrats. Lawyers give to Democrats by a ratio of 3 to 1. Actors give to Democrats by a ratio of 18 to 1. Journalists, 93 to 1. Librarians, 223 to 1. The Laura Bush loyalty is not really carrying over too far. The single largest group of donors to the John Kerry campaign this year was employees at the University of California. The second biggest single donor group was employees of Harvard University. Academics who are scuffling along there with their poor little salaries, giving a lot of money to the Kerry campaign. Maybe the salaries are higher than we think. But that's another interesting way that society has become split. We've also become split simply by the mere fact of partisanship. To me, partisanship is an incredibly important force in American life. We just saw the Yankees and the Red Sox rivalry. Well, the Republican and Democratic rivalry is just like that in some ways. In some level, the terms Yankee and Red Sox are abstractions, but they're tremendously powerful. Your partisanship, your party affiliation determines the way you see reality, and it determines the way you think. It's not as if people sit around and think, which party has the best solutions for the country, and then I'll affiliate with that party. Most people inherit their party affiliation from their parents, or else they form it early in life, and then the belief systems come on. You become a Republican, and then you value limited government. You become a Democrat, then you value equality. It's the party affiliation that shapes the philosophy often enough. These are incredibly powerful. So what we see all told is we see all these causes leading to segmentation. The geographic segmentation, we took our drive, the education, the media, partisanship, careers, all these forces, and then policy views on top of all that, what create what is a pretty stable electorate a pretty stable group of Democrats and a pretty stable group of Republicans. One of the striking things to me is that in the past 4 years, we've had 9/11, war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, recession, corporate scandals, all these things happened, and the electorate of 2004, with one significant exception, looks a lot like the electorate of 2000 and even of 1996. Basically, everything in America changes except politics. And that's a sign of how deep these party affiliations are. Now, I mentioned one significant exception, and that significant exception is that while the landscape of politics is very stable, there is a secular trend, there's a long-term trend. And that long-term trend is the ascent of the Republican Party. After World War II, Democrats had roughly a 30-point advantage in party registration. This time, it was tied at 37-37. So there's been a long-term decline for the Democrats and a long-term increase, though shallower, for the Republicans. And now we're not at a 49-49 nation, which we were at before September 11th. We're at a 51-48 nation. The 2002 election and this election basically replicated that. And so a lot of things in the campaigns were important. A lot of things about John Kerry and George Bush were important. But to me, it's the fundamentals, it's the deep structural things that are more important and shape this election more than whatever somebody said in a campaign speech or whatever strategy or tactic was adopted. There's a deep structural trend toward the Republicans giving them right now a slight majority and a deep structural draining away of support for a lot of different reasons from the Democrats. 3 reasons I'll mention are the civil rights movement, Vietnam, and Woodstock. You take those 3 things, they suggest 3 different structural forces which have all eroded support for good reasons and bad from the Democrats. So a long-term sectoral trend. And that, I think, is the landscape. But I think what's important to remember as we move forward is a couple things. First, we're still reasonably closely divided. We are now going to enter a phase of American politics, which is a phase where the Republicans will have a tremendous amount of power and the Democrats will have a tremendous amount of powerlessness. And both those both those conditions corrupt. Power corrupts, as we know. Powerlessness also corrupts. Power makes you sometimes smug, non-communicative, and bullying, and these were not exactly the Bush strong points to start with. And powerlessness tends to make you a little wild and irresponsible and sometimes delusional. And I think we've seen that inequality of power have terrible effects in all around the world, in the Middle East, for example. And we may be able to see that, we may unfortunately see that in America and in Washington. I would say to ameliorate that, 2 things. First, people are unhappy with the system they're trapped in. Politicians are unhappy to be in this stable, polarized world where they can't work across the line. If you talk to them, they're all miserable in this state. They don't enjoy politics right now, and many get out because their displeasure becomes so strong. Many can't get out because they're egomaniacs and they can't get out. But they don't enjoy this, and they're looking for a way to get beyond this system, both Republicans and Democrats. And the second thing goes back to this issue of family and work and lifestyle. I talked about the divides in this country, and this is a partisan divide and a political divide. And here's where John and I may differ. I don't think it's a cultural divide. I don't think in the way we vote differently, and we get in fights about politics, and sometimes these fights are vicious. Yet when you look at how people actually live, to me, we're part of one culture. I mentioned the divorce rates are the same across red and blue. The workaholism is the same. The average American works in 350 hours a year on average than the average European. The average American works 9 or 10 weeks longer than the average European. That's remarkable, and that's something we share across red and blue. You look at how we raise our children. We have way more children than people in comparable countries. That's something we share across red and blue. The Republicans have slightly more children. You look at the way we volunteer and give to charity. There are slight differences, but there's a lot of commonality there. In aspect after aspect of our lives, if you ask Americans, do you think you control your own destiny? Americans are off the charts compared to people in other countries. People in other countries, by and large, think, no, my destiny is part of where I was born, the long duration of history, and I have a little control. But if you ask Americans, Americans think they have huge control over their own destiny. And that goes across red and blue. So when you look at how we actually live, I think we have a lot in common. And to me, this is why this is a party divide. This is a divide, an argument of over leadership. But it's not a divide of how to actually live. And so I don't think we're in the middle of a culture war. I don't think this election can be explained by the rise of evangelical values voters who shifted the party, this election, to the Republican side. If you take a look at who actually voted, the number of evangelicals as a share of the electorate was the same as it was 4 years ago, the same as it was 8 years ago. If you look at pro-lifers as a share of the electorate, same as it was 4 years ago, same as it was 8 years ago. If you look where George Bush did well, he did better this time than he did 4 years ago in 45 out of 50 states. He did better in Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, California, John Edwards' own county in North Carolina. Most of these are not sort of Bible Belt places. He did better across the country. And I think he did better because in post 9/11 environment, the American people by and large trusted his leadership. It wasn't about values, I don't think. So we're a country that's unique, that stands out, that's a real pain in the rear end for a lot of the world. But we're a country united by a common set of ideas and a common values. And we just happen to be involved in a distinct and important and sometimes bitter fight over how we should be led. But we're not engaged, I don't think, in a civil war of how to live. Thanks very much.
David has agreed to take questions, so by all means, just raise your hand and he'll call on.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's really interesting how you're saying that evangelical pro-lifers have not actually been up. Is there a distinctive group that really has been up? And I know you say that he's done better in 45 out of 50 states. Is there a group that he's done better, or is it just like a slight, tiny bit each group that is going to add up?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's the latter. For some reason, the theory came out about this election on election night that it was the value. This was all about values. And that was in part because, I think, for two reasons. One was a bad question on the exit poll.
Right.
If you asked people, as they were asked in the exit polls, what was the most important issue in determining your vote, and you had the normal choices like terrorism, Iraq, jobs, and so on, one of the options you had was moral values or something like that. And so everybody heard moral values and thought, oh, I'm for moral values. That's important to me. So a lot of people said moral values. But that phrase is so vague it can mean anything. And so I thought they asked a bad question, they got a misleading result. When they asked later questions about specific issues like gay marriage and abortion and all those issues, there was no upsurge. In fact, if you take a look at the 11 states which had anti-gay marriage referenda on the ballot, Bush didn't do particularly well or significantly better in those states than the other states. It just wasn't a big issue. It didn't have a big effect on the presidential campaign. So the way he did do better is, as you say, in a lot of small but significant gains in a lot of different groups. Among Hispanics, he went from roughly 35% of the Hispanic vote 4 years ago to 44%. That's very important because there are a lot of Hispanic voters. Among Catholics, I think he was up 5%. Among Jews, he was up, I think, a little more. Among group after group after group, he was up slightly. And so there's no big jump. It's not as if we had a religious revival in the last 3 months to change this. We've had a gradual, as I say, a long-term gradual shift in the electorate. And it's striking to me that he made these gains at a time when, Iraq war's not going great. There were no WMDs. There were a lot of reasons why he should have gone down. But I think that helps reinforce the idea there's long-term structural advantage the Republicans, or breeze the Republicans are benefiting from. Yeah, ma'am?
Yes. In the past, there's been a perception that women will vote Democrat, but in this past election, it's very, women were very clearly divided. And so when you say, we share common values, are there, some very significant differences between women who voted for Bush and women who voted for Kerry?
Well,
I'm not sure there's commonality there.
Well, it depends. There are. I don't mean to say, when I say we share common culture, I don't want to exaggerate it. We're not all uniform. This is a big country with many different subcultures. I just don't think we're at a state of cultural war. But we do have different values about certain things. But when you take a look at well, let's take the case of women first. The women's vote was split for Kerry, but not as wide as it used to be. The big divide there was between women who were single and women who were married. I think single women in their 20s, I think they voted for Kerry 8-1 or something, some huge percentage. But married women with families voted for Bush at a very significant rate. So that suggests not so much a values divide, but an evolution in life. When you get married, you're more likely to vote Republican. And that's a very important divide. So again, it's very hard to capture what I'm talking about because there are values divides. There are different conversations going on. And so a lot of it is, and yet there's a lot of commonality nationally. So you're really talking about a very nuanced playing field. And again, I would describe the playing field as significantly different conversations between some parts of rural America and some parts of urban America. Very little knowledge about the other, but no culture war. One way to look at it, again, it's a how do you map reality? How do you map American society? And to me, the best metaphor is the high school cafeteria. You got your jocks over here, your nerds over there, your theater people over here, your geeks over there, the drama people over here. Each little table knows a lot about itself, is vaguely contemptuous of all the other groups, thinks they're better than everybody else. But they don't particularly get in fights, except for when it comes time to choose the class president. That they get in a fight about. Other than that, they're happy to live off in their segmented little worlds, looking down on everybody else. The question was, what does the Democratic Party have to do to get back on track, and how do they bridge the divide? The first thing I think they need to do, and I suggested in my column today, is not listen to anybody with access to the media. Because I think the media is tilted leftward, and I think this has been a great benefit to the Republican Party. Because while Republicans get upset, they look at the media and they think, oh, they're not telling it fair from my point of view. On the other hand, I think Democrats misread reality again and again because they see the reality that's told to them by journalists who live in Bethesda and Georgetown and New York, and they think, oh, that's reality. But it's a misleading picture of reality. So the Democrats went into their convention thinking that the country had decided to reject George Bush, and all they needed to do was say that George Bush or that John Kerry was acceptable. Well, that would have been an accurate conclusion you'd drawn from the media coverage, but it wasn't an accurate depiction of the country. And so they're in a little cultural ghetto. So I would stop listening to anybody who has access to the media, and I said in today's column, just to be safe, don't listen to me either. Nevertheless, I think getting out of that insularity and stop looking down on the people in red America, diverse as they are, is one big thing they have to do. I go to colleges and I ask, or I go to newsrooms, who's Rick Warren, who's Tim LaHaye? Well, these authors have sold tens of millions of copies. I ask people in newsrooms, their Pentecostalism is arguably the most important social force of the 20th century. From 0 Pentecostals 100 years ago, there are now 500 million in the world. Some sociologists think there'll be 1 billion Pentecostals by 2050. what's a Pentecostal? Well, if you don't know, you shouldn't be trying to represent the country. You got to know this stuff. And so there's a lot of learning, I think, that needs to be done. They're going to have an argument about whether they move left or right. But first, I think you just got to take your time and just get in the conversation that is happening out in megachurches in Red America, just so you're familiar with the conversation. That's the first step. Yeah.
What about the difference in partisanship that has come out of those who attend church regularly and those who don't?
Yeah. The question was whether there's a difference in partisanship of those who attend church and those who don't. And the short answer is yes. If you attend church weekly, I think the odds are 60%. You're 67. I'm being corrected. You're likely to vote Republican. And if you never attend, I think it's roughly similar that you're likely to vote Democratic. So there is a difference. And one of the things that's been interesting to me, the rise of the religious conservatives have been well documented. There's a rise now of what you might call secular liberals, and becoming a greater share of the electorate. So you've got two groups. But I think the thing to always remember, first starting with these two groups, the religious conservatives, there's tremendous diversity within these groups. And I would say personally, some people disagree, but I would say among, say, evangelical Protestants, there's an evolution in all sorts of attitudes that evangelical Protestants have. First, there's obvious diversity, but I would say the average of attitudes has shifted. And the way I think it's shifted is away from a confrontational Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell view toward politics and toward a more therapeutic, less confrontational, compassionate, conservative megachurch view. George Bush, for example, doesn't come out of sort of a confrontational religious community. He comes out from sort of a small groups movement, a very therapeutic, personal religious approach to religion. And so I think there's been, as evangelicals have gotten richer and more established, they've gotten less alienated and less angry. And there's been a shift in that community. There's a shift in the secular left community. And there's a big hump in the middle, which is muddled on gay marriage and abortion and all these other issues. There's a big middle there. There's a political scientist in Stanford named Morris Fiorina who's written a book just on this middle, on whether you ask about abortion or gay marriage. There's a lot of people just sort of confused in the middle. If you looked at these exit polls in this election, 25% of the people supported gay marriage outright. 35% supported civil unions. So that's 55% in support of some sort of legal recognition. They don't want gay marriage a majority, but there's a lot of, it's not like we're polarized on that issue. We're sort of spread out with a big middle there. So the religious divide is important, but it's not like a civil war to me. Yeah, back there.
Where do you see the Catholic vote trending?
Where is the Catholic vote trending? Well, EJ's coming, EJ Dion, ask him. This could be one of those questions where everybody in the room knows more about the answer than I do, but nonetheless, that's my job is to have an answer, so I will give you one. My answer to that question always is, what Catholic vote? To me, Catholics are split roughly evenly. There are a lot of Catholics in this country, not disproportionately out of tune with the electorate. Maybe people here know better, but when I look at the Catholic voter after every election, it doesn't strike me like the African American vote or the Jewish vote, lopsided one way or another. That's my general view of the Catholic vote. Sir.
I like your interpretation of not having a cultural divide so much, but as a question over leadership. However, looking at how most people would grade President Bush's leadership in military and economic matters, I'm just wondering if when you talk about leadership, or when people say they voted for him as leadership, if that wasn't just another code word for a values kind of choice. So it sounds to me like your point about leadership might be just another paraphrase of value and cultural change.
That is a very, very good question. Is leadership just a code word for values? I'd say yes, but not what we normally mean of values. When we talk about a culture war or a values divide, often we mean things like, what is your attitude toward morality, toward good and evil, toward natural law, toward social issues, toward life and death issues, abortion, euthanasia, marriage, feminism. Those are, I think, when we use the term culture war, that's generally what we're talking about. But the leadership divide is about leadership values. And to me, there are two different sets of leadership values that were on offer to the American people. One, well, let me back up. Pollsters make a distinction between professionals and managers. Professionals are people I talked about who are more the liberal arts majors, and lawyers, doctors, journalists, teachers. And they tend to vote more Democratic. And I think when they look for a leader, they want somebody who has what you might call the university values. Well-read, good at conversation, introspective, teaches, values complexity, and talks about nuance. And John Kerry embodies some of those virtues. And so they see a guy like that, they think that's exactly the kind of person I want as a leader, someone who seems well-educated and thoughtful. Another group of people, more on the managerial side, executives, look at a leader and he doesn't have to be particularly well-read. He doesn't have to be particularly, he or she, particularly introspective. But they want somebody who is good at reading people, has firm, simple convictions and the courage to stick by them, and is a straight-talking man or woman of faith. And they look at Ronald Reagan and George Bush and see that sort of person. And to me, one of the constancies you've had in American politics over the past 20 years is that Democrats tended to have nominated men who share certain traits, whether it's Carter, Dukakis, Gore, Kerry, or even Clinton, who's a bit of an outlier. People who you can imagine as cabinet secretaries, who know a lot about government, are well-read, introspective, talk about nuance. Republicans, on the other hand, from Reagan to Bush, tended to have emphasized or nominated people who are not particularly introspective, but who are straight-talking men of faith. And the two parties produce two different leadership styles. And so that's about values, but it's a different sort of values than the deep societal values. Yeah.
I was going to ask about leadership, but just cover that. So I guess what I'm curious about is why Americans want to identify with one or the other, why there's not more of an independent movement in this country.
Right. That's also a good question. The question is, why isn't there more of an independent movement? There are a couple things. First, I believe there is, that it just can't be born. I think there is a liberal party. If you looked at the electorate, threw away the politicians. There's a liberal party in this country, there's a conservative party, and there's a McCain-Lieberman party. But that McCain-Lieberman party could never be born because of our primary process. They just can't get nominated. But I think there is a third tradition that's just sitting out there filled with frustrated people. But they're only given a binary choice. In the last couple of elections, an Orthodox Republican versus an Orthodox Democrat. And so they choose sides. But remember, I talked about the power of partisanship. I just think it is very powerful. Once people are on the Republican team, they're pretty solid on that team. And on the Democratic team, they're very solid on that team. And there are not that many people in the middle. There's a debate about this. And I think Karl Rove went into the election with a theory that there are very few actual undecided voters out there. And there are very few people flip-flopping back and forth. And he seems to know everything about the country.
So do you see that more as an American phenomenon, or just as kind of a general human instinct to want to kind of boil it down, which means one or the other?
Yeah, I see it as an American phenomenon because of our primary process. If you go to Britain, there's a Liberal Democratic Party, which at least at its founding was sort of the McCain-Lieberman party of Britain. But we have a choice between two choices, and a lot of people call themselves independents, and a lot of people who say I'm an independent are lying. They're Republicans or Democrats, they just think it's cooler to seem independent. But they really vote for one party year after year after year. So I think, I served for 4.5 years as a correspondent in Europe, and I went there as a big admirer and came back as a big admirer of our primary process. Because in our system, you can have a guy like Bill Clinton or George Bush emerge out of nowhere and get to the top of his party, Whereas in most parliamentary systems, like Germany or Italy or Israel especially, it takes a long time to get to the top of your party, but once you're there, you never leave. And so you just hang around, and it's very unfluid. And so I think that's a great strength of our system. The weakness of our system is that primary voters don't represent the country, and they hive it off left and right.
Let's take one more question. Whoever you wish to recognize, David. And
There was a woman in the back against the far wall.
You have a really unique voice. You're a thoughtful conservative who liberals like me like to read. And I was looking on the internet at what people say about you. And I was struck at how much of a target you are from both sides. And I was thinking having this unique voice and being very good at it is what brought you to where you are. But on the other hand, a lot of people seem to be out to get you, and I'm curious what that is like for you.
You know, that's been the story of my past year. I've been a columnist at the Times for a year, and I started deleting emails, and there were 200,000 in my folder, and most of those emails are viciously hostile. And when I first became a columnist, I hadn't really faced this level of hostility, knowing that every column, 10,000 more people hate my guts. And it took me, and I always consider myself sort of trying, I like people on both sides. Why does everybody hate me? And it took me a while to get my skin thickened up enough so I could just handle that. And what happened was I'd try to read all the emails, and I'd get incredibly depressed because they wouldn't only go after how wrong you were, but how stupid you are, how fat you are, all this stuff. Your hair, you're bald. They go after, they're very good at. I call them my social insecurity seekers, and they would find them. And then so I said, I can't read this. I'll make my assistant read them, and then he would get depressed. So I had to get the. But that's part of two things. Being a columnist is different from being a writer. You're much more of a public figure and almost like a politician to people, and that's part of your job is to arouse them. And there are a certain number of people who are very good at typing at 4 a.m. who just hammer you, and that's just part of the sport of it. And then it's part of the nature of the age, where there are a lot of people for one reason or another who just find it impossible to like someone they disagree with. And I don't know what's the cause of that. But maybe it just goes into politics, and maybe we've always been that way. Just to answer your question quickly, it took me a long time to get my skin thickened to it, but now I'm almost like a politician. I've become into so egomaniacal that I can get through the day.
well, David, I think one thing we can say is that you survived. We hope that you were well treated. Of course, our conversations are going to continue for a little bit out in the foyer. As I said, there is a book signing out there. And once again, sir, thank you so much.